Well, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, so I like to move when I talk, so I'm usually pretty loud too, but if you couldn't hear something I said, just be like, hey girl, say that again. Um, okay. So, my name is Amina Simmons, and I'm a second year doctoral student in counseling psychology, and I'm also a member of the Challenging Racism and Empowering Communities Through Ethnocultural Research team. But since that's a mouthful, we usually just like to call ourselves crecer, which is a Spanish word that means to grow. Unfortunately, our team leader and my advisor, Dr. Guerra Nicola, could not be here today, but she definitely sends her love. What I want to spend some time talking with you guys about today is an annual event that we co facilitate called Day of Dialogue. I did it. Thank you. So before we move forward with that though, we probably want to start with this foundation of like what's the purpose of community dialogue. Now, I'm a researcher by training and an advocate by choice. And so my training tells me that we probably need to start with a little bit of theory. And so Gordon Allport has this like theory that he puts out called contact hypothesis. And for Corsair, this is really what we use when we think about engaging in community dialogues. And contact hypothesis is really just this idea that if you have the chance to have a meaningful interaction with a person from another group that you may hold negative views towards, that interaction has the potential to not only change your view of that person, but that after that, you may be more inclined then to generalize positive views towards other people from that group. Now, I would be standing here telling you half truths if we did acknowledge that both those negative and positive views are rooted in socio historical legacies that often drive our community values. And at the same time, we do this every single day. We interact with folks who experience the world with a different lens, and then the question becomes, how do we learn to have productive dialogues with one another that facilitate a space for individuals to engage in some critical self-reflection, engage as active participants, and work towards building alliances? Universities have the capacity to be powerful tools to work with communities to facilitate these kinds of dialogues, which brings us to the experiences of marginalized groups. So, oftentimes, programs or interventions that target marginalized communities focus on quick fixes for problems as opposed to changing oppressive structures and attitudes that perpetuate discrimination. Our research team is a community-based participatory action research team, and we are interested in working with communities to collaboratively develop, evaluate, or implement work and programs that reflect the strengths of communities. So then you say, Amina, how do we do that? Okay, so any person who has been doing community work for more than a day will tell you it is messy, okay? So there's this beautiful list of community building principles and subsequent action steps, and our team attempts to adhere to this, recognizing two things. These action steps are going to look real different depending on who we're working with, right? As they should if we are truly doing collaborative work with communities. And the second thing is that we miss it, right? Like, we don't always get it right, and sometimes we need to be able to go back and say, how could we have done this better? I'm going to attempt to go through each of these and let you see what the principle is and how we attempted to apply or engage it to the planning of Day of Dialogue. Now, because my time is limited, I'm probably going to focus less on the what the principle is and more on the how we tried to engage it. But we'll have time for questions, and please come find me throughout the day. So then the first thing is participation and inclusion. Corsair has been co-hosting Day of Dialogue in Miami since 2006, and every year the topic is different. As I'm sure you can imagine, changing topics means bringing together some new and some past community partners, which can and usually is a very interesting growth experience. We encourage our partners to volunteer to host the meetings in their spaces, and we see this as twofold. So it allows us all as community partners to visit and engage with spaces we may have never visited before but could truly benefit from. And it also addresses the imbalance in power that we often see between universities and communities. we're asking them to step out of their comfort zones to engage in this working group, and it's only fitting that we challenge ourselves to do the same. At our post-event feedback meeting this year, one community partner, Roberta, who's been working with us for years, shared that when she first ever got an invitation to a Day of Dialogue planning meeting, she thought we were just asking her to come, give her opinion, and that was it. But that she soon realized that we were asking her to be a part of a working group, and that for her was a truly novel idea. All right. So focusing on assets. I'm in psychology and I'm all too familiar with the deficit-based model of working with folks, especially marginalized communities. Yes, every space and communities have struggles, but what would it mean for us to focus on the assets of our communities and to empower ourselves to resolve or advocate for our home spaces? Our partners themselves are assets. On our research team, the more you passionately talk about it, the more you're showing us your ability to lead it. And that translated right into our planning meetings with our partners. For many of these organizations, working with universities, especially researchers, is an experience of being told what to do, how to be, and who they are. Not with us. Our partners are assets and experts on their communities, so we're interested in saying, here's what we have, and here's where we struggle. What do you have and where do you struggle, and how can we help each other to help others? Okay, so civic responsibility. I like to think of civic responsibility as accountability. So first and foremost, we had to be accountable to each other as a planning team, and then we had to be accountable to our communities. Now, most folks think the best way to do that is with money. And yes, it helps. And yes, all of the partners who can, including Crisare, make an equal financial contribution, which is also another conversation where we have to come to a consensus because we all contribute the same amount. But what does it mean for us to rethink accountability and responsibility from a lens that talks about things that are more valuable than money? The Multicultural Education Center is a small organization in Miami that has worked with us as a partner for a very long time, and truth be told, they don't have much money. MEC, though, brings something to Day of Dialogue that is way more valuable, and it's an interactive piece to all of our events. So this year, Miss Charles, the director, and her daughter, Audrey, who is pursuing a degree in dance, brought the women together for an interactive closing event where Audrey showed us dance and dress from various cultures and communities. But this wasn't just about putting on a show. This was about dancing and loving on and encouraging each other, learning and growing and stepping out of our comfort zones together. Now, I'm sure you can see that a lot of these principles start to overlap. And so some of these things are going to seem repetitive, and I like to think that the repetitive nature of it just kind of emphasizes the importance of these things, right? So what I want to highlight from this slide then is communication. This is an area where I think as a planning committee, we both triumphed and struggled. While the partners who stayed, because there were some who didn't, worked relatively well together, reflecting on this, we had to ask ourselves, what could we have done to make this a more welcoming space, especially for new community partners? How do we orient folks to how we'd like to engage in this sort of working group? And how do we manage all the strength and power of women working collaboratively in the midst of the reality that there's inevitably going to be conflict? We came up with some thoughts, but I'd like you all to chew on that and come find me at some point throughout the day because we'd love to hear your feedback on handling similar issues. Comprehensive. So when I think comprehensive, the first thing that comes to mind is our breakout sessions for the day. Now, the topics you see listed here are just the ones we realized we had time for, because when you're planning an event with women, about women and for the wellness of women, the first thing that we all said was like childcare, right? So like we couldn't start before a certain time because folks had to get their kids to school, and we had to end at a certain time because like everybody knows those late daycare fees are real expensive and nobody has time for that. Um, so I mean, it was a limited amount of time for us to be able to talk about everything, and we went back and forth for a very long time to decide on these topics. And the title of the event for the day was Peeling the Layers of Women's Issues. And I don't know how many of you cook, but onions have many, many layers, so we recognize that these topics really only scratch the surface. Additionally, when we think about what it means to be comprehensive, we think about what it means to collaboratively work with community members, and we want them to feel empowered to take ownership over this event. It was important to us to allow the facilitators of these different talks to do it as they saw fit. What we did was encourage it to be more of a dialogue than a lecture. But outside of that, we provided whatever they needed, from poster boards to markers to classrooms with elaborate AV setups. What they needed, we gave them. Embracing diversity. Now, diversity means so much, and I really want to talk about diversity and justice, specifically with relationship to location. So this is one of the only issues that came up in the planning meeting where like the table was like completely split in half, and there were two camps. There was one camp that was like, get away from and the arguments that they made were, are we privileging certain spaces and audience members by hosting events like this at a university? And what message does it send about the value we place and see in community spaces? I'll go ahead and give it away. We hosted it at and that was mostly for logistical reasons, right? So we reached out to different community spaces, and the issues that we ran into were parking. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Miami, but parking is not something easy to do there. Also issues of like, could it accommodate as many people as we were hoping to get, and would we be able to get the place for free? Things like that. The hosted at camp, though, also had some interesting arguments. So they talked about giving access to a space that many of the participants had never been invited to and never imagined they would have a chance to experience. After Day of Dialogue, some of the feedback we received let us know that these women felt honored and valuable, and that even if just for that day, that space didn't seem so inaccessible to them. Learning. So we're thinking about learning in three ways with this planning. The first wave is this idea of exposure learning for university folks. It's real easy to pretend that outside the campus perimeter, nothing exists. But when something is in your house and in your face, it's a little more difficult to try and ignore it. Exposure learning. For our community partners, what we wanted them to take away was learning about themselves, learning about working with people, and learning to address community needs collaboratively. And then for our participants, we were really asking questions like, what is their level of engagement? How are they learning from each other? And what are they taking away from the day as a whole? So then finally, we have focus on results. Now listen, when we were putting this presentation together, Dr. Nicola and I were talking, and I was like, all right, focus on results, what are we gonna do? And she was just like, baby, because she calls all of us baby, because she's our academic mama. And she was just like, we gotta unpack this term results, right? Because it can mean lots of different things to different people. And she said to me, Amina, we have to think beyond the day. She's big on having action-oriented pieces of any of the work that we do. And with that, what we did was we developed a Slack app team. So Slack is a team communication app where you can share images, messages, videos, etc. And we created the WOW. WOW stands for Wellness of Women, the WOW Miami Slack team. And it was a way for us, initially as an organizing team, to have consistent communication with one another. And then for the Day of Dialogue participants to stay connected to each other and the organizers. Because see, we understand that this is just the beginning of the conversation. In our last meeting, one of our partners from the Miami Workers Center, Marcia, says, what I want to know is, what's the point of us staying connected? And while it came as a challenging question, because it was an important one. And to the extent that we understand that we may never have an answer that satisfies everyone, we talked about it. We talked about supporting each other's events moving forward. We talked about advertising for one another. And one partner even suggested that Day of Dialogue 2017 is going to be Wow Miami Part 2. But this is just a starting point. For us, Day of Dialogue happened, and that was a success because these women, all doing and leading amazing work in their separate silos, were able to come together, do this event together, and the community members, their community members, our community members, sat in spaces talking, learning, and teaching each other. So for us, the success really was in the planning. Thank you.